Now, a conversation on the Justice Department's new civil asset forfeiture policy. From Washington Journal, this is 25 Minutes.
Clark Neily joins us at our desk for the first time. He serves as Vice President for Criminal Justice at the Cato Institute. Joins us today to discuss a shift in policy by the Trump administration on the issue of civil asset forfeiture. But before we get to that shift, let's define some terms. Explain what civil asset forfeiture is.
Sure, and so you know, I don't use the term civil asset forfeiture. I think that plays into the government's terminology. I use the term civil forfeiture. These are not assets. Oftentimes these are people's cars that they use to get to work, their homes that they live in. So civil forfeiture, there are two kinds of forfeiture, criminal and civil. Criminal forfeiture is after the government convicts somebody of a crime and then proves that particular property, a car or a house, was involved in that crime in some way. And so then they take the proceeds of the crime or the means that were used to commit it. Civil forfeiture is much different. All the government has to do is assert that the property was involved in a crime somehow. Then they get to take it, and then the burden shifts to the owner of that property to try to get it back. And the procedures for doing so are mind-numbingly complex. So the government likes to use civil forfeiture because it is almost impossible for someone to get their property back once it's been taken.
You say the government likes to do this. Can you give us a sense of civil forfeiture, how often it happens in dollars or number of cases?
It's very difficult to determine because the government actually doesn't keep track of the difference between civil and criminal asset forfeiture. When I used to work at the Institute for Justice that did the most comprehensive study on this, what they documented was that the Department of Justice uses civil forfeiture about 87% of the time. So in other words, of all the forfeitures of property that this Department of Justice undertakes, 87% are civil instead of criminal. And that shows you just how much they prefer civil.
So explain to us what happened last week at the Justice Department. What policy was being shifted here?
So at the macro level, what Attorney General said was that he was going to be very aggressive and going to instruct the Department of Justice to be very aggressive in using civil forfeiture to roll back some of the reforms that occurred under the Obama administration. And he actually used the term, he said it is a key policy. He said civil forfeiture is a key policy, and he has instructed prosecutors within the Department of Justice to be extremely aggressive in using it. And as I said, he's rolled back some of the reforms that were implemented under the Obama administration to try to protect innocent owners.
Here's the Attorney General from last week talking about what he sees as the benefits of civil asset forfeiture.
Civil asset forfeiture is a key tool that helps law enforcement defund organized crime, takes back ill-gotten gains from them, and prevent new crimes from being committed, and weakens the criminals and their cartels. It weakens the criminal organizations when you take their money, and it strengthens law enforcement when we can share it together and use it to further our effort against crime. Even more importantly, it helps return property to victims of crime. Civil asset forfeiture takes the material support of the criminals and instead makes it material support for law enforcement. Funding priorities like new vehicles, bulletproof vests, opioid overdose reversal kits, and better training are all paid for by asset forfeitures. In departments across this country, funds that were once used to take lives are now being used to save lives. And it removes the instrumentalities of crimes such as illegal firearms, ammunition, explosives, and property associated with child pornography from criminals, preventing them from being able to use these tools to further their criminal acts. President Trump has directed this Department of Justice to reduce crime in America. We take that seriously.
The Attorney General there on the benefits of civil asset forfeiture. What is your criticism of it?
So many. Those are the supposed benefits. And let me just start with the idea. He said that this is a key tool in defunding organized crime. I would like to know just how often the Department of Justice can connect any given forfeiture to organized crime. I used to work in this field. I used to litigate these cases. I've never seen a forfeiture that was actually tied to organized crime. You know where these forfeitures often come from? Just working people. Here in Washington, D.C., there was a lawsuit by the ACLU. You know what they determined? That the median amount of a cash forfeiture in Washington, D.C. is $120. In Philadelphia, it's $178. These aren't assets. This isn't organized crime. This is pocket money from ordinary working Americans for whom there's never been any proof that the property was actually involved in a crime. It's disgraceful and it needs to stop.
If you want to join our conversation this morning with Clark Neily of the Cato Institute, Democrats, it's 202-748-8000. Republicans, 202-748-8001. Independents, 202-748-8002. As the Justice Department announced last week that they were going to roll back some of these efforts by the Obama Justice Department to limit civil asset forfeitures. They also said that they would protect individual rights. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein said that the Justice Department will include more safeguards now to prevent the kind of problems that have been documented in the past. Some of the things include the adoption of authorizing a federal adoption of assets seized by state and local police when the conduct that led to those seizures violates federal law. Rosenstein said the department is adding safeguards to ensure that police have sufficient evidence of criminal activity when property is seized. Property owners will receive notice of their rights within 45 days, which is twice as quickly as allowed under current law. Law enforcement agencies will be required to provide officers with more training on asset forfeiture laws. Does that make you more comfortable with
Not
this change of
whatsoever.
policy?
It's all window dressing. It's all window dressing. You know what would be a serious reform? There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of documented abuses. Here's what I'd like to know. Were any of the officials, including Department of Justice officials, who committed those abuses disciplined in any way? Because as far as I know, the answer is no. We'll know they're serious about protecting innocent people from having their property taken when they start disciplining people who commit these abuses. So far, the number of law enforcement officials disciplined for abusing civil forfeiture appears to be very close to zero, if not zero. So let's wait until they actually get serious.
How long have you been studying this, and why did you get into it?
So I've been studying this I've been working on civil forfeiture for about 5 years, including at Cato and the Institute for Justice. And the reason I got into it was it makes me very angry when I see the government stealing property from innocent people. And that does happen. And I use the word stealing intentionally. I also think it's incredibly problematic because it diminishes public respect for law enforcement when people think, and unfortunately all too correctly many times, that this is all about policing for profit. That is exactly what's going on much of the time, and it needs to stop.
To Baltimore, Maryland. Jerry's our first caller in this segment. Line for Democrats. Go ahead.
Good morning, and thank you for taking my call. Since the Attorney General has, brought this back, I was wondering if this is a tool that Robert Mueller can use in the investigation against Trump and his administration and Jared Kushner with their money laundering of their property in New York. I don't know if you've seen that recent article about Trump's laundromat, but I believe it goes back to the 80s when he was supposedly going bankrupt. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that. Is this something that can be used?
It's conceivable. It would depend on the crimes involved. I think it's important to remember one very important thing, though. Civil forfeiture is mostly used against people of limited means and minorities, and that's a demographic fact. So I think it's unlikely that civil forfeiture would be used in this setting because it's very much a tool of preference that's deployed against people of limited economic means and racial minorities. That's how civil forfeiture is most often used, and I'd expect that to continue.
The caller brings up Jared Kushner, expected to arrive on Capitol Hill in the not too distant future. He's scheduled to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee on their probe of Russian interference in the 2016 election. That Senate hearing happening this week happening today, happening behind closed doors, also going to appear this week before the House, also in a closed hearing setting, but expected to arrive at the Hart Building this morning on the north side of the Senate, not too far from where we are. So we'll look for that arrival. In the meantime, Will, Sterling, Virginia, line for Independence. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I have a question. In this country, we're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. So if you haven't been convicted of a crime, if I'm understanding this rule correctly, you can have your property seized. How is that not illegal under, illegal search and seizures? How is that even possible if you haven't been convicted of a crime, but they just think you are guilty?
It's a great question. The answer, in short, is that we have a judiciary that is asleep at the switch much of the time. It refuses to enforce significant constitutional limits on government power, and you have put your finger on one of them. Civil forfeiture is a massive violation of procedural due process for precisely the reason you mentioned, because it presumes guilt instead of innocence. It is massively unconstitutional. And the good news is there's just the bare glimmer of some judicial interest in this issue. And in fact, Clarence Thomas wrote an opinion very recently in which he called into question the constitutionality of civil forfeiture, and it's possible we could begin to see some progress on that front.
To Mike in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, Republican. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. I have one question. I live up here almost on the West Virginia border. And what about how they do stuff? What about, there's a lot of, gangs, motorcycle gangs and all that kind of stuff up here. And nobody ever seems to do anything about that. I mean, it just runs. There ain't nobody losing their property or none of that. So, I'm kind of, I don't understand how the system works. They go, there's a certain group of people that just do whatever the hell they want, and then there's a certain, so now they confiscate your house because they think you did something wrong, okay? And they just take it. That's it. Over and done with.
So that's a really good point, and I agree with you. I think you're right to be outraged. And let me just make this point. One of the worst things about civil forfeiture is that it distorts law enforcement priorities. So instead of policing violent crime, motorcycle gangs, things like that, what we've got law enforcement doing is enforcing crimes that result in more money for them through civil forfeiture. So it distorts law enforcement policies. By the way, you should know this. The national homicide clearance rate in America is about 64%. The clearance rate for all violent crimes together is less than 50%, and we have a policy that has been embraced by the Attorney General that diverts law enforcement attention from enforcing and investigating these violent crimes and has them focus on raising money through civil forfeiture. I think that's disgraceful.
So the caller brings up the example of a biker gang. Explain how civil asset forfeiture might work in a hypothetical case that's being built against a motorcycle gang.
Well, okay, so being in a motorcycle gang is not illegal. That's an important point to keep in mind. Now, if they are engaged in some kind of illegal activity, which sometimes they are, maybe they're running drugs or something like that, then you would build an investigation and you would essentially document the illegal behavior. And if there were assets involved, motorcycles, cash, drugs, things like that, you could seize it all. Now, here's an important point to keep in mind about this, and I want to underscore something I said a moment ago. The decision whether to proceed with a case like this depends in many cases whether there's money available for law enforcement to forfeit. Here's a question I'd like to ask the Attorney General. 87% of federal forfeitures are civil, not criminal. And yet, you instructed the U.S. attorneys back in May to charge the most serious, readily provable crime. So you've got all this money being taken through civil forfeiture, which can only be done if you believe that a crime has been committed, and then you're not prosecuting those people. Is there an office within the Department of Justice that decides who gets a free pass when it comes to criminal activity? The Department of Justice says, oh, well, we've got your assets, so we're not going to go ahead and prosecute you. I can't reconcile these two policies. Attorney General Sessions says that people are losing their property because they're suspected of being criminals, but then they don't get prosecuted. I have a really hard time understanding how that works.
Clark Neily is Vice President of Criminal Justice at the Cato Institute, with us for about the next 15 minutes or so as we talk about civil asset forfeiture, or civil forfeiture as you refer to it. Kevin is in Woodbridge, Virginia. Independent, go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I'm retired from the military, and I did a long time. I put in a lot of years of service in defense of the Constitution, to include the amendments and the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. My concern here is twofold. Number one, because I buy a high value or a high value asset, maybe all my life I've dreamed of getting a sports car, a certain sports car, so I save my money. And I go and buy this car, and I decide to drive down the highway, and somebody are in a uniform, a law enforcement uniform, because they decide they want to make money, decide to pull me over, stop me for what they consider probable cause, which may or may not be there, and then turn around and say, prove to me that this car was not bought with ill-gotten gains. And because I don't have any proof, because you don't carry that kind of proof in your car, this must be drug money, it's ours. That just infuriates me. The second thing is, how can we leave it to someone who is at the low level on the street to determine how someone got a certain asset or how they did? That is just ludicrous. It makes me think my 30 plus years of defending this country were worth nothing.
Kevin, thanks for the call.
Well, first, I thank you for your service, and you're exactly right to be outraged. Civil forfeiture is massively unconstitutional. It is a disgraceful public policy, and it does result in the seizure of people's vehicles and homes and money from innocent people all the time. I know that personally because I've worked on these cases, and you can just Google civil forfeiture and you'll see so many abuses that it's just will surprise you and shock you. I want to give you one example. This actually happened in Las Cruces, New Mexico. There was a city attorney who was doing a continuing education program on civil forfeiture for law enforcement, and he actually described to a room full of prosecutors and police officers exactly how they might go about targeting a car that they coveted. So you see somebody, and he used the example of somebody driving a Mercedes, and he said, hey, if you want that car, here's how you get it. And he described how you would follow the person around until maybe they went into a bar to have a couple of drinks, and when they come out, you wait for them to start up the car, and then you seize it, and it becomes the police department's property. So to the extent you're worried that this could happen, you're exactly right to be worried, because this does happen.
Two questions from Twitter. When and where did civil forfeiture get its start? And what is the success rate of reclaiming your assets once you've been cleared of any wrongdoing?
Great question. So this goes all the way, actually, believe it or not, to medieval England. The laws went on the books when it was basically the British government needed some way to seize ships in which contraband goods had been brought into the country. That came over here across the Atlantic to the United States. It was used very briefly in the colonies, but essentially fell into disuse. Came back just a little bit during alcohol prohibition, and then with the war on drugs, it absolutely blew up. And civil forfeiture went from a policy that was rarely used to a policy that is widespread today. And I'll give you some numbers. In 1984, the Department of Justice took in less than $100 million in forfeiture money. In 2014, the year for which statistics are most recently available, it was $4.5 billion. That's the war on drugs and its effect on civil forfeiture, a 4,600% increase in the use of forfeiture.
And the success rate for reclaiming assets?
No one knows, because those statistics aren't kept. What I will say is this. Civil forfeiture is an extraordinarily complex area of law. It makes the tax code look like child's play. I've litigated these cases. Just to find a lawyer who could competently handle one of these cases is a Herculean effort. They're extremely expensive to litigate. All of the rules and procedures are on the government side. They deliberately stack the deck to make it hard to get your property back. So you're going to have a really hard time once it's been taken.
Sarasota, Florida. Joe is waiting, a Democrat. Good morning.
Yes, I agree with Clark Neily. This is highway robbery from law enforcement. Not only we have to worry about the thieves, they're making in the billions, and this is not right. We need to do something about it because this is highway robbery. I mean, it's not right. We need to do something. We need to call our representative. We need to change these laws because this is absolutely ridiculous.
Clark Neily, what's being done to change the law?
So there's good news here, and I absolutely agree with you. Look, believe it or not, there is actually data that shows that the government took in more money in forfeiture than were stolen from property owners by burglars in the last year. So it is rampant, and your description of it as highway robbery is not an exaggeration. So here's the good news. There are now 14 states that have eliminated civil forfeiture. In other words, there are 14 states where the government must get a criminal conviction before they can take your property. That's exactly where the policy needs to be headed, and I think that's where the policy is headed, and here's why. 84% of Americans oppose civil forfeiture, according to a poll by my colleague at Cato, Emily Eakins. If you look at the bipartisan array of people and organizations that oppose it, it's the ACLU, it's Think Progress, it's the Heritage Foundation, the Institute for Justice, Cato, Senator Mike Lee, Justice Thomas. The list goes on and on. I can't think of a policy on which America is more united than its opposition to civil forfeiture, and I think it's a shame that our Attorney General is swimming against that current and diminishing respect for law enforcement by supporting a policy that America has made clear that it hates. Why does America hate this policy? Because it's unfair, unjust, and unconstitutional.
The Cato Institute is online at cato.org if you want to check them out. Another Joe is in North Olmsted, Ohio, Republican. Go ahead.
Thank you. The cesspool is filled with the legal system. The attorneys that bring these laws to the books have someone that they can sue and take their money from. It is not the legal system has nothing to do with morality anymore. It's the enemy of the people. For every law that is created, there is a criminal act that the people suffer under. And that's what's taking place. Sessions is the biggest disappointment by this. He is an attorney. And I know there's good attorneys out there, and I know there's reasons for people to have attorneys. But this suing that's going on and all these laws that are created to inhibit the American public from being free is criminal. This is not a moral system any longer.
Well, it is frustrating, and I understand your frustration. Let me say this: I have to at least say one thing in favor of the Attorney General. He's got a really difficult job. The Attorney General is responsible for enforcing so many federal criminal laws that his own department can't even count them. They've tried and they can't do it. There's more than 4,000 federal criminal laws, and the vast majority of which are blatantly unconstitutional because they involve subjects that are not committed to the legitimate responsibility of the federal government. And pity the Attorney General having to enforce so many laws that his own department can't even count them, and most of which are unconstitutional. So I do have some sympathy for the nature of that job.
One more Joe, Baltimore, Maryland, line for independence. Joe, go ahead.
Hi, good morning, and thanks for taking my call. Interesting. While listening to the conversation, several questions come to my mind. The first one was regarding the fact that the minimum amount of forfeiture is $120. My guy, $120, government is losing money every time pursues $120, so it's a dumb rule, by the way. The other one is the fact that if the individual is supposed to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, then they already clearly unconstitutional. They are turning the law on its head. That's
going out there, Joe, but I think we got your question.
I'd love to take your second point because it's so important in understanding one of the worst aspects of the new Sessions policy on civil forfeiture. What this does essentially is it enables the federal government to displace state policy. And let me unpack that for you. As I said, 14 states have eliminated civil forfeiture. Many other states, about half the states, have enacted other reforms. So it's very clear what direction the states are moving in. Here's the disgusting thing about a federal civil forfeiture. Through a process called equitable sharing, the federal government is able to step in and work together with local law enforcement to subvert local policies, and essentially what they do is they step in, they do the forfeiture under federal law, and then they kick back up to 80% of the money that they've gotten back to a state or local law enforcement agency, even in a state that has determined that the forfeiture done in that case should not be permissible under state law. You get the feds involved, they displace state law. It's an absolute violation of the principle of federalism, and I'm shocked to see somebody like Jeff Sessions, who supposedly supports federalism and the division of power between state and federal government, supporting a policy like this which subverts local preferences.
Jason Haskell on Twitter says, I'm sitting here wondering why the government needs to be so deeply involved with our lives. Peter is in Great Falls, Montana, a Democrat. Good morning.
Hello. Kudos for C-SPAN. I love your show. And being a Democrat, I'm seldom find myself in alliance with the Cato Institute, but this is one of those instances. One of the things I didn't know about is I didn't know states could also indulge in this practice. And I guess you've answered my question about that. And I would just like to add that it is because of this federal forfeiture or this civil forfeiture type action that I have never carried more than a couple $100 when I travel. And I travel a lot because I'm a contractor. and I have to go all over the United States. And for that reason, I've never carried more than $300 at me at any time while traveling.
I'm mortified to say this as a fellow American, but I think that's a very wise policy. I want to tell you one quick story that happened a couple of years ago when I was at the Institute for Justice. There was a Burmese Christian rock band that was touring the United States to raise money for orphanages in Thailand. Their manager was returning to Dallas from one of their concerts. He had $53,000 in cash that had been raised through these concerts that was going back to Thailand for orphanages. He was stopped in Muskogee, Oklahoma. There were no drugs in the car. He's never done drugs in his entire life, but the police seized that $53,000. They stole it from him, and it was only because we were able to publicize that story and get it to the #1 spot on the Washington Post website that the the district attorney in Muskogee relented and gave the money back. That was highway robbery, and it happens every single day in America, and it happens under the guise of civil forfeiture, the most corrupt and corrupting policy in America today.
Well, we'll have to end it there, but a topic I'm sure we'll talk about again down the road. Clark Neily, Criminal Justice Vice President at the Cato Institute. Appreciate the time.